guys, welcome back. As always, my name is Leyzar, and today we're going to be talking about the brand new resistance and vulnerability system in Warframe. Before the Jade Shadows update, Tenor was supposed to know the details of each and every individual enemy type. For example, let's take the Corrupted faction, or what was the Corrupted faction. Within this faction, you had two heavyweight units that everybody knew. The Corrupted Heavy Gunner and the Corrupted Bombard, two very different units with two very different attacks. While both of these units had clone flesh as an underlying health type, their armor was different, so the type of damage you were supposed to hit them with was also a bit different. For example, the Corrupted Heavy Goon had Ferrite armor, and Ferrite armor was vulnerable to corrosive damage, while the Corrupted Bombard had Alloy armor, and Alloy armor was vulnerable to radiation damage. Now, there weren't a whole lot of weapons that could do radiation and corrosive at the exact same time, a bit more after the Whispers in the Wall update, but still, most Tenor would simply build corrosive because corrosive will be reducing the enemy's armor, therefore your subsequent shots will be doing more and more damage. The degree of resistance or vulnerability before the patch would range in increments of 25%. As stated, corrosive would have a 75% damage bonus versus ferrite armor, but radiation only had a 50% damage bonus versus infested. After this patch, everything is down to 50%. So you're gonna see modifiers such as 0.5, so you're doing 50% less, or 1.5, so you're doing 50% more. One thing of note here, if a damage modifier is not specified within the damage efficacy screens, that means it's 1x. Let's say you want to find out the damage bonus or resistance of Puncture versus the Sentient. It doesn't show up in the efficacy screens, that means it's 1x. It doesn't have any bonus nor resistance, so therefore Puncture versus Sentience does 100% of the damage. Now all of these aspects that we knew to keep in mind in order to mod our weapons properly is gone now. The biggest thing that you need to understand is that the system has been changed so that resistances and vulnerabilities are no longer tied into the previous health types, which don't really exist. All armor has become armor, all health has become health, all shields have become shields, and now Overguard is recognized as its own thing. Resistance and vulnerabilities are now tied into the faction a unit belongs to. With that in mind, let's take a look at how faction exists post Jade Shadows. Starting off with the Grineer, everybody's favorite. You will see that no matter what unit I choose from the Grineer, it will be vulnerable to impact and corrosive. What kind of damage bonuses am I looking at? 50%. And look at that, no resistances whatsoever. Whereas before, different targets would have different resistances and vulnerabilities, now everybody is vulnerable to the same thing as long as they belong to that specific faction. So all you gotta remember nowadays is that X faction is vulnerable to this and to that. Now, things get a little bit kooky. Let's take a look at the Orokin. The Corrupted aren't exactly corrupted, even though you have Prime Bane of the Corrupted, it actually should be Prime Bane of the Orokin, but I digress. Here are the Corrupted Heavy Goon, our favorite targets, but you will see that the Corrupted Heavy Goons are no longer vulnerable to corrosive. What? Does that mean they no longer have armor of any type? Well, they do still have armor, and yes, that will be contributed obviously to the EHP that they have. They are now vulnerable to puncture and vital damage. So while as before I was building corrosive on my weapon versus the ferrite armor that Corrupted Heavy Goons had so I can get that 75% damage benefit, now it's no longer the case. Instead, if I'm after a contact damage bonus, I want puncture and I want some vital instead. Normally vital would be relegated to your sentinel as a primer, but nowadays I'm just gonna build it on my weapon if I know I'm gonna be fighting the Orokin. But here's the thing, it doesn't mean that corrosive is useless now, far from it. That Corrupted Heavy Goon still has a whole lot of armor. If I manage to remove some of it, my subsequent shots will be doing more and more damage. What it does mean is that corrosive and vital are simply changing places in your setup. Whereas before you will build corrosive on the weapon for the contact damage, now you build vital on the weapon for the contact damage, and corrosive, well, kind of takes the place of vital on your little primer. I don't need to prime them with vital anymore, instead, I'm gonna prime them with corrosive. And the only change I need to make is this, boom, corrosive on my primer. Now that we know that, let's assume you're the kind of Warframe player that likes to play the game on easy mode. Check that, super easy mode. Therefore, I'm gonna pull out my giant incarnate turret. Now let's take a look at the build. Is this the right build? What is this? Corrosive and radiation. This is a build meant for the Murmur before the Jade Shadows update. But let's say I'm gonna be fighting some Orokin, the Corrupted Heavy Goons to be more specific. What do I need to know? I need to know the resistances and vulnerabilities. Would you look at that? The Corrupted Heavy Goons. Now I know they have armor. They're vulnerable to puncture, vital, and resistant to radiation. These vulnerabilities and resistances will be shared across the entire Orokin faction. If they're bombards or wardens or lancers or butchers, we're just gonna spawn in corrupted heavy goons because they're a bit more tough. If I sneeze towards butchers, they die. So therefore, let's make some modifications to the build. They're resistant to radiation. Well, that radiation needs to go. That's not good. Corrosive, they do have armor, but they don't have any damage benefit to corrosive, and my little sentinels are proccing them with corrosive. Oh, this works out perfectly. It's almost like I planned it. All I need to do is build vital. What do you know? Prime cryo rounds. Now I got a whole lot of vital on the weapon. And the final mod slot will go to the faction modifier, Prime Bane of the Corrupted, which actually should be Prime Bane of the Oracan, but there you go. Now let's see what this little build can do versus level 205. Corrupted Heavy Goons with the Steel Path modifier enabled. I'm not even gonna go Incarnate form because what you need to know, especially after the weapon stacks, is that the normal form of the Incarnate Torrent or Torrent Incarnate, whatever the hell, was that a 5 million? Is absolutely incredible. The normal attack absolutely murderizes whatever stands before you. Actually, when you're fighting the acolytes, it might be a smarter idea, depending on the acolyte, to use the normal attack of the Incarnate Torrent instead of the Incarnate version. Look at that. One shots galore, no problem whatsoever. Primed or not primed, or almost primed. But I know what you guys want to see. You want to see the Incarnate form. Leyzar, how fast can I vaporize the entire room? Well, my friends, this fast. Don't blink, because you will probably miss it. Obviously, I'm using the Incarnate Torrent, and the Incarnate Torrent is a goddamn beast. Totally not overpowered, and it should never be nerfed. Ever, 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 ever. Now, of course, that's one example, but let's take a real-world example of taking an existing build and changing it so it fits the brand new changes brought with Jade Shadows. Take a look at the Exceltra Prime. Now, this is one of the most popular primary weapons in the game. It doesn't mean it's one of the most powerful, it's one of the more popular. As you can see, this build had corrosive and radiation. Corrosive and radiation was fantastic versus the Murmur, which again is currently our whole endgame content. Any Murmur unit I select will be vulnerable to electricity and radiation. So technically, I only really need to do one thing, take off one mod. And you'll also notice the following: the Murmur are resistant to vital damage, so no way am I making contact vital damage. I still want the proc, definitely, especially if I'm gonna be using something like Hunter Munitions, but I don't want to build for contact vital damage, yes? Now, all of these units have one exception. Of course, I'm talking about the XMSs. XMSs will have Overguard, and against Overguard, if you want to, you can build a brand new Magnetic proc, which will have bonus damage versus it. Normally, Magnetic is still to be used like it was used before the Jade Shadows update, as in one additional element for Galvanized Aptitude Shot, and so on and so forth. So the only thing I really need to do is take off the Infected Clip, and boom, radiation and electricity. Again, it doesn't mean that that corrosive was worthless. They do have Colurvins, which do have armor, so removing some of that armor will mean more damage versus them. But then again, the Colurvin are pretty easy trash targets to take out. You sneeze and they basically died. You can definitely go for an electricity build and make them a little bit more jittery, if you know what I mean. But the question becomes, okay, fine, what should we build in the remaining slot? Here's Rifle Elementalist. Rifle Elementalist got people a little bit too worked up for what it is. 90% status damage. What does it help with damage over time? So slash, heat, etc. Honestly, it's not a bad mod to have, but if it comes a discussion between a faction modifier like Bane of the Murmur, or we should be getting Prime Bane of the Murmur, and that one, just go for Bane of the Murmur. Now, Papa's got all the simulacrums. Which one do you want? Actually, this red fail one is kind of fetching, especially in HDR. Level 205 Murmur battle group with the Steel Path modifiers enabled. Now let's see what Miss Citrine can do versus them. Look at that. Beautiful, beautiful. Now, of course, Citrine's buff are also helping. I'm talking about her glorious free, but look at that. Here's the thing, the Exceltra is not exactly an endgame weapon per se. I mean, it pales in comparison to something like the Torrent, but the honest truth is that one change to the build and you will have no issue whatsoever in essentially demolishing anything and everything that stands before you. Because that's the whole gist of the thing. You just gotta change your builds a little bit. And in case you don't know or don't want to memorize, hey, I don't want to memorize that faction is vulnerable versus that faction, I would like to remind you that nowadays you need to remember a whole lot less than you needed before. You can access all this information in the simulacrum by simply viewing all the enemies, or you can go to the Universe tab in your codex and simply stare at a faction to find out the resistances and vulnerabilities. Honestly, Warframe has never been more straightforward than it is right now. As always, my name has been Leyzar. Thank you guys so much for watching. Like, favorite, share, and subscribe only if you enjoy the content. If you got any feedback for me, let me know in the comment section down below. Also in the comment section down below if you want to find out more about mechanics. Like, hey, Leyzar, do a video on this stuff and the other stuff. Or, of course, the other stuff. I'll catch you guys in the next one. Bye.